The third millennium, forged anew in fire. As the time of the three emperors dragged on with none of the claimants achieving final superiority, a dreadful threat to mankind was stirring in the frigid shadow of the World's Edge Mountains. The county of Sylvania, the most infamous region of the Empire, had long been shunned by most folk of any sense, but its wicked reputation truly began when Vlad von Carstein, a vampire of ancient lineage, wrested control of the province from the previous ill-loved Count Otto von Drag by marrying his daughter Isabella von Drag to Vlad von Carstein in 1797 IC. Vlad and Isabella came to share a true, if unholy love, and Vlad transformed her into a particularly vicious vampire, the first of his new von Carstein lineage. Many of the other Sylvanian noble families objected to the thought of having an outsider rule them, but these dissidents were quickly silenced by foul and unnatural means. Under Vlad's tyrannical grip, the province soon flourished for the first time in its history. The elector counts of the Empire looked on with indifference, too caught up in their own schemes for power to pay much attention to a poor and backwater province. For the next 200 years, Count Vlad von Carstein ruled over Sylvania under the guise of different identities to prevent anyone from becoming aware of his undead nature. In 2010 IC, judging the Empire to be at its weakest, Vlad launched his attempt to become a vampire emperor, beginning the first of a series of vampire wars upon the Empire. The Vampire Wars, from 2010 to 2145 IC. Marching at the head of the Sylvanian army and a massive host of undead troops he had raised from the graves of Sylvania using a potent necromantic spell drawn from one of the books of Nagash, Vlad invaded Sturland and laid waste to Ostermark before turning his attentions to the heart of the Empire. However, in 2025, Vlad was slain by Jarek Kruger, Grand Master of the Knights of the White Wolf. Unfortunately for the Empire, not even death could hold Vlad for long. Kruger's body was found at the base of Ulrichsburg 1 year later, making Vlad's return apparent. For the next 25 years, Vlad's undead armies ravaged the lands of the Empire until 2051 IC. He eventually fought his way to Altdorf, the seat of Prince Ludwig, one of the three claimants to the title of Emperor. The siege lasted for many months, but in the Empire's darkest hour, the Grand Theogenist of Sigmar, Wilhelm III, seized Vlad in a desperate grip and bore him from the city's walls, impaling them both on the wooden stakes that lay at the bottom. With Vlad dead, much of the Sylvanian army began to disintegrate as the necromantic magic maintaining its undead troops unraveled, and the surviving vampires of the von Carstein line were forced to retreat. Prince Ludwig rallied his forces to give pursuit, but fearful that victory would allow him to cement support for his bid for the imperial throne, his rivals united against him, and the pernicious undead laws of Sylvania were allowed the time to regain their strength. Years later, Count Conrad von Carstein emerged as Vlad's successor and launched another invasion of the Empire. Conrad was so vicious a vampire that the three claimants to the imperial throne were forced to ally against him, and he too was ultimately defeated. The dust of his ashes floating in the wind, cut down by the dwarf hero Grufbad and the soon-to-be Count of Marienburg, Helmar, at the Battle of Grimmoor in 2121 IC. The last and most dangerous of the vampire counts was Manfred von Carstein, a subtle, devious, and treacherous vampire lord who was perhaps the most dangerous of the von Carstein line. He allowed the various contenders for the imperial crown to think that with Conrad's death, the threat from Sylvania had ended, and simply waited for the civil strife to begin anew. When the Empire was once more racked by civil war, Manfred attacked, his undead legions marching through the snow to Altdorf and defeating all the armies that gathered to oppose him. He appeared triumphant until the Grand Theatonist of Sigmar, Kurt III, appeared on the battlements of the city and began to recite the great spell of unbinding. Seeing many of his undead troops crumbling to dust, Manfred ordered a hasty retreat. After a failed attack on Marienburg, the vampire count was forced to return to Sylvania. The imperial nobility finally put aside their self-interested scheming and invaded Sylvania in force to end the threat of the undead once and for all. Eventually, Manfred was brought to battle at Helfen in 2145 IC, where Prince Martin of Sturland cut him down. For his heroic feat, the Count of Sturland claimed all of Sylvania as part of his province, and thus ended the Vampire Wars. Though the ever-present threat of the Vampire Count's return ensures that none forget the dread of Sylvania, where the dead never fully rest. Though now officially a part of Sturland, Sylvania is now an abandoned province where the dead are easily stirred and the dark forests are prowled by unknown terrors. The dawn of the 24th century IC saw the development of an even greater threat to all the peoples of the old world, this time in the north. The powers of the Chaos Gods had waxed fat upon the myriad sacrifices of their faithful and the excesses of humanity and other mortals over the previous centuries. The hand of the ruinous powers began to move with great strength across the face of the Warhammer world once more. Auroras were seen as far south as Nuln. Omens in the temples of the Empire spoke of a coming time of great danger, and Kisleven scouts reported a vast, horrible army composed of the forces of chaos gathering beyond the Taiga in the Chaos Wastes under the command of the powerful Northman and champion of Chaos Undivided named Asavar Cool, the ever-chosen. The great war against chaos was about to begin. The Great War against Chaos, from 2302 to 2369 IC. In 2302 IC, the forces of Chaos, comprised of Chaos Warriors, Beastmen, and even powerful demon hosts, crossed the River Linsk into Kislev, laying waste to the Kislevite cities of Erengrad and Prague, and marching on to besiege the capital city of Kislev. The siege of Prague had lasted throughout the spring and summer, with the city's brave defenders hurling back their attackers time and again with desperate heroics and stalwart bravery. But as winter set in and the year drew to a close, Prague fell and the hordes of chaos ran through its tortured streets. The raw power of chaos engulfed the city, and Prague was changed forever. Its survivors fused together into hellish and inhuman mutant shapes. Living bodies fused into the walls of the city itself, so that it became impossible to tell flesh from stone. Distorted human faces peered out from walls, agonized limbs writhed from the streets, and pillars of stone groaned with human voices. Prague had become a living nightmare, and stood as a grim warning of the suffering that lay ahead for the whole Warhammer world if the warriors of the ruinous powers proved victorious over the forces of order. A chaos fleet sailed the Sea of Claws, laying waste to the coasts of the old world and sinking any ships they could find. The Tsar of Kislev sent messages to each of the Elector Count's courts, begging for help. But the response was confused and bordered on panic. No leader was chosen for the Empire's military efforts, for none of the Elector Counts trusted the others enough to cede authority to him or her. The high priests of Sigmar and Ulrich squabbled with each other over who should take the overall command of Imperial forces, whilst many of the nobility refused to send help for fear their neighbors would attack their lands in their absence. Some even felt the cause was lost and openly began to worship the dark gods, hoping for mercy from the forces of chaos after the Empire's fall. One man did not give up or give in to fear and apathy. Magnus von Bilthofen of Nuln, a young noble and priest of Sigmar, still believed in the dream of a united empire, strong enough to defeat the forces of chaos and the demonic servants of the dark gods. Within the city of Nuln, a powerful Tzeentch cult known as the Magi led the largest of the uprisings, unleashing demons and other horrors upon the city. Those who remained loyal to Sigmar prayed for deliverance, receiving an answer in the twin-tailed comet that soared through the night sky. Magnus saw the comet, and inspired by his grounding in the Church of Sigmar, used his influence as a minor noble to rally the people. Under Magnus's leadership, Nuln was liberated from chaos and took his crusade across the Empire. Magnus was a magnificent orator whose rousing speeches raised a massive following amongst the common folk of the Empire. He marched northward from city to city, addressing the people in the marketplaces, gathering about him an army the likes of which had not been seen within the Empire for centuries. Other imperial armies also began to muster from the electors and other powers, either swayed by Magnus's tongue or afraid of any refusal to aid the growing force. By the time Magnus reached the great city of Middenheim, his legions of followers became the largest military formation ever assembled within the Empire. In 2302 IC, he reached Middenheim, where he sought an audience with Jarl Ulrich Christoph to gain support for the war. After Christoph denounced Magnus as a charlatan, Magnus bravely walked through the Sacred Flame, a holy site of the Church of Ulrich, which separates the pure from the tainted, and the truthful from the liars. After miraculously emerging unscathed, Magnus had proven the righteousness of his cause and gained the support of a powerful ally. He tactfully appointed Christoph as the leader of his cavalry force. Just as the Empire finished uniting behind Magnus, a message was received from the Kislevite leader Tsar Alexis Vasilievich. It told of a crushing defeat inflicted on the army of Kislev, leaving her cities wide open to attack. Magnus heeded the news and decided to march to Kislev, and once there, to take the fight to their foe. As the new year began, he finished consolidating his army and split it into two mighty forces, one of infantry and one of cavalry, setting Jarl Ulrich Christoph to lead the former and heading the latter himself. With their greater mobility, the cavalry force headed towards Kislev to buy time for the second half of the army. In Talabheim, Magnus met with Peter Laszlo, who was accompanied by 3 high elves. The war had reached its crisis point as the forces of chaos prepared to cross the border into the Empire. The elves were powerful archmages, namely Teclis and his 2 comrades, Finreyr and Irtil. Although Magnus had a strong faith in Sigmar, he did not have the same faith in the men he led. Despite knowing they could defeat any mortal enemy, the demons of chaos were not mortal. Magnus knew that the advantage the armies of chaos had over his own lay in the winds of magic, but traditionally, any man of the Empire who dabbled with magic was seen as a pawn of chaos himself. With the help of the High Elves, however, a new system could be devised to allow humans to wield the winds without opening themselves to corruption. With this new status quo possible, Magnus declared an amnesty to those who could use magic, subject to the judgment of the High Elves. Teclis and his brethren subsequently used their own arts to assemble those who could be taught. The High Elven wizard Teclis and his companions had joined Magnus during the march north and assisted him with their advice and magic, and also trained a few of the Imperial wizards in how to use magic to defend their brethren. After they learned of the fall of Prague, dwarves from Karaz-al-Karag, though themselves under siege by chaos forces and green skins, joined the Tsar within the city of Kislev. The first assault of the Chaos forces, mainly composed of beastmen, drove the Kislev defenders from their outer defenses and behind the city walls. It was the stolid determination of the dwarves that prevented the hordes of beastmen from breaking through the city gates. As the Chaos hordes prepared for a second attack, they were struck in the rear by the combined forces of Magnus's Imperial troops and Teclis's devastating magical assault. The Chaos champion, Asavar Kul, divided his forces and sent one attack to the city and one to counter the Imperial army. The Imperials managed to inflict a resounding defeat upon the troops of the Chaos hordes sent against them with Teclis's magical support. But the forces of Chaos were too large to be completely destroyed, and they eventually redeployed and managed to push the Imperial army onto the defensive, keeping it away from the relief of the city. The High Elven mage, Yertle, was slain by a Keeper of Secrets. On the city walls, the battle between the forces of Chaos and the Imperial Relief Army was seen by the Kislevite defenders. 300 dwarves broke out of the city gates in an attempt to try and reach the Imperial Relief forces, but they were beaten back. Only half of the dwarves returned to the beleaguered Kislevite capital. When it seemed that all hope was lost to the defenders of the city, the advance Imperial force, which had been sent to relieve fallen Prague but had turned back to rejoin the main body of the Imperial army, appeared on the northern horizon, on the Hill of Heroes, and launched a devastating attack born of hatred upon the Chaos forces. Watching the enemy suddenly broken by the appearance of the Imperial reinforcements, Magnus spurred his men on to one last Herculean effort to relieve the city. Seeing the forces of order had gained some momentum, the gates of Kislev were opened, and the Kislevites and their dwarf allies spilled forth to slam into the army of Chaos from yet another flank. Caught between three separate offensives on every side, the forces of Chaos lost all discipline, milling as a mass to be cut down where they stood. As Magnus prepared to lead another charge, a voice warned him of a beast in human form approaching. The enemy leader, Asavar Kul. The Ever-Chosen challenged the champion of Sigmar to single combat as a test of might between their respective gods. After an awesome conflict of great magnitude, Magnus eventually triumphed, disarming Kul and knocking him to the ground. After removing his helmet, Asavar admitted defeat, saying he had failed the Chaos gods and the fight belonged to Magnus. Having slain Asavar, Magnus touched his golden hammer and reflected, "It was your gods who failed you. My God is always with me." At the same time, the Kislevite and dwarf troops broke through and engaged the Chaos army at their respective flanks. Caught between three armies, the Chaos horde was finally ground down and destroyed, saving the old world from being Chaos's thrall. Ulriksson and Vasilievich recognized Magnus as the instrument of Chaos's defeat, with Erengrad being relieved and Prague leveled for rebuilding. Chaos was driven back to its domains. As the last piece of cleanup, Magnus's army destroyed the cursed city of Mordheim, before liberating Ostland and Ostermark and clearing the Empire's forests of beastmen. After their defeat, the strength of the ruinous powers of chaos slowly ebbed away and returned to their pre-war strength. But an echo of the realm of chaos would always remain within Prague, though it was leveled and subsequently rebuilt. The Chaos Gods returned to their eternal bickering and infighting. The power of chaos undivided once more submerged beneath the ruinous powers' own intense antipathy for one another. Magnus, who had earned his moniker the Pious, returned to the Empire as its greatest savior and warrior since Sigmar himself, and was quickly installed as the new Emperor by the Elector Counts, largely to popular acclaim, and because he now commanded the loyalty of a very large, very battle-hardened army. Magnus proceeded to purge the lands of the Empire of the taint of chaos and the anarchy of bandits, greenskins, and beastmen that remained for several years after the end of the Great War. Order was eventually restored across the Empire and in Kislev. Though Finubar resisted the idea, Teclis taught the humans of the Empire the principles of magic, as understood by the High Elves, and helped them found the colleges of magic with Emperor Magnus's full agreement, as it had become clear that despite the Imperial prejudice against the use of magic as being tainted by chaos, humanity and the Empire would need its power if it was to successfully defend itself from the future depredations of chaos. On Ulthuan, despite Tyrion's attempts to reclaim the Blighted Isle, the Dark Elves eventually succeeded in occupying the Altar of Cain. Emperor Magnus reigned for 65 years, and many regard his reign as among the happiest periods in the Empire's long history since Sigmar's own rule. A general peace reigned throughout the land, and the reunification of the Empire brought increased commerce and prosperity as trade flowed like water. Magnus took steps to increase the defenses of the Empire against the dark powers of chaos and their servants, removing the ancient imperial ban on wizardry and even creating the imperial colleges of magic under the tutelage of the high elf wizard Teclis, the most powerful mage of the Warhammer world, who had come to the Empire's aid from the high elven kingdom of Ulthuan during the Great War against chaos. A new age of intellectual vigor and inquiry had begun for humanity. Magnus also recognized the changing balance of imperial power between city and country, granting Nuln the status of a city-state, whilst ratifying the political reintegration of Middenland and Middenheim under the Todbringer Grafs of Middenheim. His distant cousins, the Middenland von Bildhofens, had died during the war, but Magnus had no desire to claim the province for himself, and denied his brother's right to do so. Instead, its electoral vote was put into abeyance. Magnus also acceded to the formal reunification of Talabheim and Talabakland, which had already occurred for all practical purposes centuries before. Magnus of Nuln died in his sleep in 2369 IC. For his great works, devotion to the Empire, and dedication to Sigmar and his dream, a conclave of the electors voted to give Magnus the posthumous title the Pious, and declared his birthday to be an empire-wide Day of Thanks. The Reikland Bloodline of Emperors, from 2429 to 2519 IC. The Empire could not long escape its own fractious nature. The electors rejected Magnus's brother Gunther as his successor, and instead chose Leopold Unfahiger, the Elector Count and Grand Count of Stirland, as the new emperor. As had happened before under the imperial electoral system, the need to bargain led successful candidates to cede imperial powers and privileges to the electors, gradually weakening the emperor's office once again. This problem led the Unfahiger emperors to seek other sources of imperial revenue to give them leverage against the other electors. Emperor Dieter IV carried this tendency too far when he reputedly accepted large bribes from the burgomeisters of the great commercial city of Marienburg to acknowledge its independence from the Empire as a free city-state. The scandal of an entire imperial province breaking away with the Emperor's permission was so shocking that an emergency meeting of the electors was called in the Volkshalle in Altdorf. In 2429 IC, the electors deposed Dieter IV and put in his place Grand Prince Wilhelm of Reikland, the direct ancestor of the current emperor Karl Franz I. To avoid a civil war after the defeat of an imperial army outside of Marienburg, the new Emperor Wilhelm III recognized the Westerland's independence. It soon became known as the Wasteland in the Empire, perhaps out of a sense of pique, and made Dieter IV the Grand Duke and Elector Count of Talabakland, from which he detached Talabheim as a separate city-state in a manner similar to Nuln. Perhaps it was fear of what disunity had almost cost them during the Great War against Chaos, but the imperial electors, their vassals, and the priests of the imperial cults all made a serious effort to avoid another period of civil war. Clandestine aristocratic maneuvers and conspiracies were another thing, however. The current emperor, Karl Franz, acceded to the imperial throne in 2502 IC as a young and vigorous man, ruling from the imperial capital of Altdorf like his predecessors. He showed more skill and character than all of his immediate ancestors, and held out the promise of strong leadership for the empire. The electors felt pressured to toe the imperial line, and he skillfully played the cults of Sigmar and Ulrich against each other in their attempts to gain his favor. Pundits and scholars alike claim that Karl Franz is able to maintain order by forcing each imperial faction into deals that are mutually acceptable. With an excellent understanding of leverage, many of the Emperor's political victories have been won by granting a person not what they want, but instead what they do not want any of their rivals to have. Using such tactics, Karl Franz was able to convince the guilds of Altdorf to sign the infamous Stench Act of 2506 IC, committing themselves to large fines and fees, not because they believed in a cleaner Altdorf, but because they thought the cost would destroy their rival guilds. a powerful statesman, aided in no small way by the excellent advisors he has chosen. Emperor Karl Franz has managed to steer the empire through many dangers.